So our last video of the semester walks you through some thinking on cyclical versus structural deficits. At the end of the day, in any given year, the deficit that is reported, right, and the deficit is just the difference between tax revenues and spending. The deficit is just the sum of the cyclical component of the deficit and the structural component of the deficit. So we want to think about these two components of the deficit and why it's important in terms of our discussion with regards to the long run deficit of the U.S. So in order to do this, we've got to pay attention to the NAIRU. Our old friend the NAIRU comes up, the natural rate of unemployment. So what we'll see is that if unemployment is approximately equal to the NAIRU, then the deficit is the reported deficit is going to be just the structural deficit. Right? It's just going to be a function of the tax laws and the spending that Congress and the President agreed to. Because when the unemployment level is approximately equal to the NAIRU, the cyclical component, right, the cyclical component is zero. So now we have a situation where if the unemployment rate is greater than the NAIRU, so we're up here, we're in a downturn. So this is an economic downturn there. Then we've got a situation where the deficit is going to be actually less than, in negative terms, right? A deficit's going to be a negative number. The deficit is going to be less than the structural component because the deficit is made up of the structural component plus that cyclical component that has now kicked in, right? The cyclical component's going to be non-zero. It's going to be greater than zero because the economy's in a little bit of a downturn, and so spending in these occasions rises and tax revenue falls. And then on the other hand, when the economy's in an expansion and unemployment is less than the natural rate of unemployment, then you have a situation where the deficit, as reported, is going to be greater than, remember the deficit's a negative number, so that means that the difference between tax revenue and spending is going to be closer to zero, is going to be closer to a surplus, or maybe even a surplus, but the deficit's going to be greater than the structural deficit because the cyclical portion of this is in surplus. So the structural deficit still exists. In fact, no matter what the unemployment rate is, as long as we don't change tax policies or spending policies, as long as in any unemployment level that we see here, the deficit in terms of the structural component of it never changes. What is changing constantly is the cyclical component of the deficit, and that relates to where the economy is in terms of expansion or contraction. So when the economy is going well, the structural component is washed away a little bit by the cyclical surplus that exists when unemployment is a little bit lower than normal. So let's look back at history and see, at recent history, and see how this matters. So if we look at a timeline of fiscal policy and the deficit over the last about 20 years, going back to 1994, so this is the Clinton presidency, right here, and then you've got the Bush presidency approximately. And then you've got the Obama presidency from 2008 to present. So during the Clinton presidency, unemployment was pretty much lower than the natural rate of unemployment. So Clinton did a couple of things here to shore up the structural component, right? He increased tax rates and tax revenues during his presidency, but also he enjoyed a huge cyclical surplus which drove down deficits. So in the Clinton presidency there were small deficits, and actually the deficits became surpluses over those years. Now in the Bush presidency there were some structural changes that occurred. Chapters 3 and 4 and actually Chapter 2 in red ink describe those. But in the Bush presidency, tax revenues fell because tax rates fell, and spending rose, largely because of the pharmaceutical bill that Bush passed, that Congress and Bush signed. So what happened here was that for most of the Bush presidency, though, unemployment was pretty close to the natural rate of unemployment, and the deficit rose during those times because the structural component of the deficit increased because Bush was reducing tax revenues when he reduced tax rates, and then he also increased spending. Then the final part that we'll look at here is the Obama presidency. Here we have a situation where for much of his presidency, unemployment has been greater than the natural rate of unemployment. Unemployment's been high, we've talked about that. And during the Obama presidency, there's been really, really large deficits. Deficits have mounted very rapidly. But he's done a couple of things to shore up the structural component of the deficit. He has increased tax rates, which has increased tax revenues. And he's also changed spending in a way that's actually reduced spending, both short run and long run, which has had a positive effect on reducing the deficit. But the culprit here, in terms of the increased deficits, is that cyclical deficits, the cyclical component of the deficit has skyrocketed because unemployment has gone up so much during the Obama presidency. But the reason why this all happens, and it doesn't matter if a Republican or a Democrat's in the White House, since 1935, when we look at how the U.S. government has handled downturns, what it's done is use the ideas of John Maynard Keynes to spend against the deficit. That's exactly what the Obama administration has done to try to mitigate the effects of downturns and not make them as sharp as what they would be if the government hadn't stepped in and created some artificial stimulus spending, either in the form of unemployment insurance or in the form of actual stimulus packages like the one that was passed in 2009. So we can imagine a world in which the government doesn't do anything during either expansions or contractions, and the critical value here is the NAIRU in understanding when the government's going to start to push back against some of the forces of downturns. What it's doing when it is giving citizens who are out of a job unemployment insurance in the form of some income that can allow them to still spend when they don't have a job. All they're doing is trying to mitigate the length and the trough of those downturns. And this is something that's been done since John Maynard Keynes wrote his famous treatise in the 1930s on that was based on what he was seeing during the Great Recession, and it's been part of U.S. fiscal policy since Franklin Roosevelt was in office in the mid-1930s.